recording has started to confirm. So can you all please confirm that you're okay with being recorded?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
Great, thank you all. All right, whenever you're ready, I'd prefer if you could introduce speaker order.
Of course. So from the affirmative, Thomas Lee will be the first speaker from Gun High School.
And the second speaker will be Anshika Agarwal, also from Gun High School.
As for the negation, the first speaker is going to be Davis Turner from Nueva, and the second speaker is going to be Rajiv Sharma, also from Nueva.
Okay, are we good to go? Awesome. Today, we strongly affirm the resolution that this House, as a Pacific Island state, would reject Chinese developmental assistance. Before we go into their case, let's go over some top-level framing. First of all, let's evaluate this round as a policy round. I think it's the best way to evaluate the validity of the statement. Therefore, it should be weighed on net benefits. Whichever team provides the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people should win today's debate. On to some definition. Pacific Island states are the list of islands and states in the Pacific Ocean. Currently, there are 15 Pacific Island countries and areas included in the country cooperation strategy for Pacific Island countries. But there are many other like small islands that aren't really considered that are considered Pacific Islands, but aren't considered states. Let's go into some background information. First of all, we see that China's developmental aid assistance is mainly pushed forward by their Belt and Road Initiative in recent years. In this initiative, China is trying to use economic incentives and investment opportunities to expand their global influence and their trade routes across Asia, across Africa, and Pacific Islands as well. So let's go into the first contention. First contention will be about why the Belt and Road is bad and therefore why it should be rejected by Pacific Island states. Currently, we see that Pacific Island states are doing well with their current aid and level trade, which is mainly from countries like the U.S. and other Western states. First of all, we see that over the past 20 years, the United States has invested over $5.21 billion into assistance to Pacific Islands. This is going towards infrastructural development, promoting local industry, promoting like fishery, tourism, ultimately benefiting these local industries, allowing them to use this money to grow themselves. Moreover, we see that the U.S. has provided $40 million to help Pacific Islands nations prevent and control COVID-19. So this money is going towards lab preparation, infection control, and public health communications. That's ultimately increasing the hospital capacity for these Pacific Islands and allowing them to mitigate the risk of COVID-19. But what will happen once Pacific Island states accept Chinese developmental assistance? It's going to detriment their economy and their countries for four main reasons. The first is that it outcompetes local industries. We can look at past precedents for this. The flood of Chinese imports decreased Kenyan cement exports by 40%, which led to the World Bank warning that Kenya's economic competitiveness was decreasing. So given that this is happening with their Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, it would likely be replicated in Pacific Island states as well, in which China starts to flood in their exports or imports into the Pacific Island countries and ultimately displace local producers. And this is especially relevant in the fishery industry, in which many Pacific Island countries rely heavily on. Second of all, we see that there's going to be a major effect on unemployment. China's policy of employing Chinese labor for its infrastructure projects in countries like Africa has resulted in more than 200,000 Chinese citizens displacing local workers. So this would likely be replicated in Pacific Islands as well when China starts to invest in all this infrastructure project, which displaces local workers because they're importing or they're putting in Chinese workers to work instead. But the third reason is that of debt. According to the International Monetary Fund, Samoa and Tonga are at high risk of external debt distress. In fact, 52% of GDP and 42% of GDP respectively are contributed to or that's how much debt there is. And both countries have significant debt to China. We see that debt is a problem because of China's debt diplomacy. In fact, China has lent at high rates to countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan to hand over ports to China on a 99 to 40-year leases once they default on loans. And we see that other countries are at risk of this default as well, which would ultimately hurt these Pacific Islands because they're just defaulting on their debt. But the fourth is that of rights. We see that China has provided surveillance technology such as facial recognition to many governments in its Belt and Road Initiative. And once they have this technology, the governments have a tendency to use these tools against political opponents and activists, which can hurt rights in these Pacific Island states. So this ultimately leads us to the impacts here. The first is going to be long-term economic growth. The key difference between Western aid and Chinese aid is that Western aid is allowing these local industries to grow themselves because because the U.S. is giving this aid and developing local industry, while China comes in and starts to take over their industry and starts to take over workers and start to compete with their exports, which ultimately hurt the local industry. And so in the long term, these economies are not growing. And that is worse for the Pacific Island states and when they're trying to increase economic growth and increase quality of life and decrease poverty across the islands. Let's go into the second contention. This is about Chinese hegemony. Currently in the status quo, we see that China is a rising hegemon. The One Belt One Road policy is aggressively pushing economic trade and greatly favors China. China is building infrastructure in countries and then demanding exorbitant fees and debt. So this goes back to our debt diplomacy argument, which is a major foreign policy tool China uses in order to expand its global influence because it's gaining access to ports and military bases across the world. In these different countries that expands their global and military influence. Moreover, we see that investment in Africa shows that they want to expand their sphere of influence where the US is weak. So you can look to Advantage 1 that shows that China's assistance to Pacific Island states would basically be like the Belt and Road Initiative. The Financial Times also writes that China's economy has grown to become second only to the US, and in the past decade, its global trade influence has also spread. And China will gradually usurp the US as the major supplier of goods to Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. A major area of concern is the South China Sea in terms of Chinese hedge. The Diplomat writes in 2019 that Beijing shows no sign of letting go of its claims of sovereignty over the South China Sea by boosting its military presence in the region, ignoring all international law, military, and naval exercises. China also wants to take control of Pacific Island regions, which creates potential clash with the US. Currently, we see that Pacific Island nations have a special relation with the US, in which the US is responsible for its security and defense matters relating to the country. Moreover, a report by the US-Chinese Economic and Security Review Commission found that as a potential Chinese military base or facility in the South Pacific could have implications for U.S. military presence and training in the Indo-Pacific region and pose obstacles to U.S. strategic goals in the Pacific. So ultimately, what happens when these Pacific islands accept Chinese developmental aid is that they're helping China further their hegemonic goal. And since hegemony is a zero-sum game in this instance, it will also likewise decrease U.S. hegemonic control. Ultimately, their developmental assistance will boost China's presence in the Pacific Island. With debt diplomacy, their military presence in the Pacific increases and ultimately puts it on the clash to the US. You can specifically highlight our warrant here that the US has a special relationship in which it is responsible for security and defense matters. So once China starts to come into these areas, the US has an obligation based off its past relationships to come to increase its presence as well, which puts the US and Chinese on clash to war. So this leads us to the impacts of tensions with the US, which can lead to conflict and war. It can cause a lot of death, but ultimately hurt these Pacific Island states as well when conflict is preventing economic growth from happening. Moreover, Chinese hedge is bad, human right abuses, but China is perpetrating a systemic oppression of minorities such as the Uyghur Muslims. For those reasons, vote affirmative.
Okay, for a brief order, I'm going to go through the neg case. There are two neg arguments, and then we go to the AF case in order. Give me 1 second. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? And if I cut out, just let me know. Is anyone not ready? No? Okay, my time will begin now. Hi, judges. My name is Davis Turner, and I'm the first speaker for the negation side. We stand in strong negation of the resolution that this House, as a Pacific Island state, would or should reject Chinese developmental assistance. And we have two reasons as to why Chinese developmental assistance is good and why you ought not reject it. And the first one of those reasons is for economic reasons. Specifically, if we look at the economic makeup of Pacific Islands, specifically Kiribati, Micronesia, amongst others, we often see that they're very resource development, specifically on phosphate-based products. And we've seen in the past 20 years that even with US aid, they haven't been able to develop significant local industry to push them above economic lines. According to a recent study, they found that they were 200% behind in the economic place they should be in order to provide a sufficient level of per capita income. In fact, the per capita income of the island nations, specifically of Micronesia and others, ranks amongst the lowest of countries in the world, even after US aid. We also see that there's like no meaningful economic benefits happening right now, and they have no place to improve, especially since local resources are drained and they have no opportunity to get new ones, even from US aid, because they aren't currently providing it. We also see that obesity rates are increasing in these countries in the status quo, suggesting that they often don't have access to high quality resources and high quality infrastructure. We can also see that from China's interventions in other places, specifically in OBOR, is that China has has a very big ability and has the power to transform these economies. If we look to countries they've intervened in, Ethiopia, for example, they provided assistance in developing a light rail system, which rapidly increased GDP per capita as more people could get to new areas. We also see using other products that they invested, they built new infrastructure facilities and upgraded telecommunications in these African countries, which made it easier for people to talk to one another and thus do business. This had a huge economic effect on these countries, and I'll get to this more later on their argument about OBO bad, but specifically we see that there's actually large economic effects, and also in Angola, unemployment decreased by 4.5% as a result of Chinese involvement. This should tell you something about the nature of Chinese involvement, especially how a majority of their projects are not concentrated on specific like material goods, but rather large infrastructure products. They have provided over $350 billion in infrastructure aid, which is really key to these island states, which don't have opportunities to invest in new infrastructure and expand resource-wise. We can also see as a nature of China that developmental assistance also is generally paid off. They often pay off this debt. Specifically in Ethiopia, they paid off their debt in 2017 and paid off Pakistan's debt in 2015 as a result of these projects. And now they're only flourishing GDP-wise and per capita income-wise. This should tell you something about the nature of Chinese products. This developmental assistance by China is really key for economic reasons, and the affirmations plan on the linked level would only be worse for that because it means that these countries who currently are accepting US aid continue to believe that US aid is the answer when in reality it is not. And what does this mean? It means that the countries that are often phosphate-based that have no opportunities to expand are going to continue to perpetuate their per capita incomes, which in the last 20 years have only decreased and aren't going anywhere in the status quo. That is really bad for a quality of life basis, but also job access and other resources, which are non-existent in most of these countries, which the affirmation again only perpetuates. And quality of life is really important. And if there's any opportunity to prove to you that Chinese developmental assistance would have any sort of increase in quality of life, it's a reason to vote for the negation side. And another smaller reason you should vote for the negation side, not necessarily as important, but also really relevant, is the fact that Chinese, by framing China as specifically in their advantage as OBO or bad, is also xenophobic to some degree. Even if they're not necessarily xenophobic in themselves, it often perpetuates this framing of how we see China as a bad actor. We always talk about like Chinese colonization in other countries is really damaging and they're just an existential threat. We often see this in the way the military is framed as though like the military has to go against China. We've seen reports from foreign policy and other sources stating that like the biggest problem with the US military is framing China as a threat. We always want to believe that China is going to intervene places and just be really, really bad. But an Economist article in 2017 found that in reality that is factually incorrect. If we do an analysis level, we actually see that the aid that went to other countries was highly successful and they paid off the debt, but we never want to say that because it's really hard for the US military to accept that China is getting more power than the United States. This has become really flawed in the way we treat China, and it only means that if we continue to frame China as an existential threat in the link level, by the affirmation passing this plan, it only perpetuates this existential threat that China is constructing. Look at their argument of OBO bad and saying China is a really bad actor. They make everything they go to worse. This only makes the US military see China more as a big threat and something to avoid, and only perpetuates the stereotypes of like xenophobic ideas. Look to the fact that Cato, Foreign Policy, and The Economist all found that China is a actually decent actor in many ways that we don't often consider. All the countries they have gone to, GDP per capita and per capita income have all increased, and debt has been paid off. They tried telling you that Pakistan struggled, but in reality, that debt was paid off. These are things that often go ignored, and realizing them in the negation by ensuring that China can actually have the opportunity to give aid to countries is really, really key. Now let's go into the affirmation case. We agree with all the framework and definitions. Let's go into the first advantage. The first advantage, they tell you that OBOR is really bad. And they first tell you like the US aid is really good. Again, extendable uniqueness I read on the negation disadvantage, specifically about Pacific Islands have actually not had opportunities to expand even with US aid. Per capita income is declining and their resource-based economies don't get any necessary resources from the United States to expand infrastructurally and to the levels which would allow them to flourish later on. They also tell you this example about the cement plant being really bad, but we tell you that most of the Kenyan cement was consumed and used for later infrastructure projects, which according to the IMF was an actual net benefit since more construction went on. They also talk to you about like a job loss and replacing jobs, but again, extend the Angola warrant. In Angola, unemployment dropped by 4.5 points within Luanda, which is the capital of Angola. Even if it displaces some jobs, the net job benefit is significantly outweighs this and proves to you that more people end up having jobs and per capita incomes also rise net, which is good for the people as a whole. They also tell you like specifically more generally that long-term economic growth is already happening. We tell you that long-term economic growth is only going to occur to the extent that we need for these countries to succeed through OBOR. OBOR is really good for long-term growth, which is specifically key why we should not reject OBOR to begin with. This impact level analysis is not very strong either. We tell you that OBOR actually has bigger impacts than they seem to disregard. OBOR ensures that countries actually have transportation mechanisms through the light rail projects I mentioned in Ethiopia, and it also means that new job opportunities are created. Also on the second advantage, they talked to you about Chinese hegemony being bad. They first talked to you specifically about the Financial Times and global trade increasing. However, we tell you that like Chinese hedge, they've paid off debts in the past. And we also see a couple of other things. The first one they give you is about the South China Sea, and they give South China Sea, they give them more power. This is totally unrelated to the South China Sea, and we see that in, getting involved in Pacific isn't going to give them necessary leverage in this conflict. It's a totally obscure example, not necessarily relevant to how China would gain power within these regions since they're unrelated and not necessarily in conflict. They also tell you like helps China advance towards their goal of beating out the US, but again, these projects aren't necessarily served in that favor. Even if OBOR like does something for certain African countries, we haven't seen the large effect on China. It's this continual idea that the US perpetuates that China is gaining power, when in reality, the only countries that are actually prospering are the countries that get the aid themselves. We've seen a lot of these other countries, we've seen China specifically not gain too much power, and this is just the motive that the US is perpetuating, not to mention the fact that this doesn't necessarily give them more ability to like Uyghur, to continue these the camps of Uyghur. Like the Uyghur Muslim camps are going to exist, and this doesn't necessarily make it easier for them to do it since they're not getting away with it now. So there's no reason why the affirmation plan is necessarily going to solve for that, since these already happen in the status quo. We just tell you that helping economies that are actually in need is probably a really good net benefit, because the other harms of the Chinese hegemony are going to exist anyway. And also, you can probably turn this as well. Look to the xenophobia example. If the US continues to believe China is a threat, the articles we read mentioned that the military of the US, the only thing that they're going to do is continue with military power, which only makes the risk of conflict higher. So for those reasons, vote neg.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the order for the speech is going to be first on the negations case in order, and then going back to both AF arguments in order. Let's start with their first disadvantage, which is on the economy and how what China does is actually going to be beneficial. We're going to be making two key turns here. The first is that they specifically try to tell you that like China's economy, or that China helps boost these countries' economy, which they can't do with US aid because they're unable to develop their local industries. The turn we're making here is that Chinese workers will often be flooding these local industries, so these industries themselves won't develop. The people there aren't going to be the ones that are getting jobs. The overall economy is not going to be increasing. We saw this happening in Africa with the Belt and Road Initiative, where over 200,000 jobs were lost simply because Chinese workers ended up flooding these industries and taking those jobs. So we're not going to be seeing economic benefit there. But the second turn we see here is that a lot of times Chinese industry is going to outcompete the local industry. Look to our Kenya warrant that tells you that the flood of Chinese imports due to the trade partnership that was formed decreased Kenyan cement exports by 40%, leading to the World Bank to warn that Kenya's economic competitiveness was declining. Now, they might try to tell you that this cement was later used for infrastructure. They don't warrant this, don't buy that. But what we do see is that in that time frame, Kenya's economic competitiveness went down to a point where a global agency had to warn that the entire country was at risk of decreased competitiveness. You're going to be buying that argument and that analysis and that warrant more than what they say about the cement being used, because this is obviously a much higher magnitude impact. But the next thing they tell you is that China has the ability to transform the economy. But we see that the economic detriment that happens outweighs. They cherry pick a few examples of a couple of countries where unemployment is decreasing. But when we look to past precedents, we see that China has actually a lot of times invested into infrastructure that hasn't actually ended up being productive. The USCC writes that Australia's prime minister said that a lot of times China will build roads to nowhere when referencing their aid. So that shows that a lot of the technology that's developed doesn't actually end up serving a lot of use. But instead, what happens is that the employment needed to build those roads only goes to Chinese workers, and a lot of the local people end up suffering. But what we also see is that we give you like examples of like taking the aggregate of a lot of the African countries where this program was implemented and seeing hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. They might give you one or two countries, and like sure, there might have been marginal benefits in some places, but on the like if we're looking at this from a global and a much larger viewpoint, we're going to be seeing an overall net detriment to these countries, which is like with the whole weighing mechanism of net benefits, we're going to be seeing net harm there. So don't buy that argument. Then they tell you that like they give you a couple examples of how China has helped pay off debt in some countries. But we see that the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, is called a debt trap for a reason. In most cases, we see that China floods these countries with a lot of debts that they can't end up paying back. And only like China is going to end up benefiting because they increase their influence in the region. They increase their own economy at the expense of the countries that are already there. You can look to the conceded warrants on our case, which I'll get into a little bit later. But let's move on to their second argument, which is on xenophobia. We see this as a non-unique argument. We see that the Pentagon has labeled China and Russia as its greatest military threats. This one plan alone isn't going to do anything to like suddenly worsen the state of xenophobia. They tell you that according to the Economist, we don't look at China's successful examples. We're not saying that China isn't successful or always bad. We're going off of specific models of their economic strategies in their past to make reasonable predictions. We're not trying to perpetuate any sort of xenophobic rhetoric in this round. We also see that this isn't a reason to reject Chinese developmental assistance. We should be looking at the impacts of accepting Chinese developmental assistance as it relates to the economy and its hegemony. So that's why the xenophobia argument doesn't really apply to this round. Let's move on to our case. Essentially, they concede the key arguments here that show you why in the past we've seen examples of Chinese economic assistance actually being a lot worse overall. They once again try to give you a couple of examples of like Angola and like one or two other countries. Once again, we are giving you like evidence that sort of takes the aggregate of a lot of the African nations that were involved with Belt and Road. So you're going to be preferring that much larger like scale warrant. But we also see that they tell you once again that like the cement was consumed and used for more infrastructure later, at the point where China has also been like taking over the local industries in other countries. You don't just need to look to Kenya. Look to the fact that China outcompeted local fisheries by exporting their fish to the Pacific Islands. And this is a very geographically similar location to exactly what the plan is talking about. So you can still look to that warrant as a reason for why Chinese developmental aid is only going to be outcompeting local industry once again. They try to give you they try to tell you that they have counterexamples as to why like there's not actually a debt trap, and actually we see like technology increasing these countries. But once again, marginal increases in tech advancements are outweighed by the unemployment and other economic detriment that's going to happen first. At that point, if the economy is on a downward trend, any new technology or any small developments in technology aren't going to matter. Then you can look to the link on rights that goes completely conceded, where we see that Beijing has provided surveillance technologies such as facial recognition to Angola, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe. However, some of these governments have a tendency to use these tools against political opponents and activists. So that's a unique impact scenario, like from everything else, that shows you why specifically all of these tech advancements aren't actually that good. So they can actually be used to harm the very people of the country. And lastly, look to the other conceded link about how a lot of the projects that the Belt and Road Initiative will invest in actually ends up doing nothing for the country and being super unproductive. So yeah, they might tell you that there was some sort of light rail systems developed, but at the point where those don't end up being useful for the countries, there's not really a net benefit there. Let's move on to the second argument, which is on Chinese hegemony. Basically, the one response they make here is that China is not going to gain that much power. However, our empirics simply disprove this. Look to the South China Sea, where China was able to seize control of the world's busiest sea lanes and thus be able to increase its military presence there. Analysts provide the analysis that Beijing is going to increase is going to use a similar model in the Pacific Islands, which the US views as a threat to its national security and its allies. So then we have this unique scenario of US and China tensions that goes completely conceded. You can look to all of our warrants and analysis that basically prove to you that in the past, China has used economic assistance as a guise to gain its military power. This happened in the South China Sea, and we're going to be seeing it happening again in the Pacific Islands. And the reason why this is uniquely bad is that the US already has a vested interest in the region. Look to the fact that we tell you that a lot of the states in the Pacific Islands have a lot of like national security connections with US. So like at the point where the US is literally telling you that like any increase of China in that region is going to pose tremendous obstacles to our like strategic advantages, we're going to be seeing a lot of increases in tensions there, which only links into the increased risk of war. They tell you that there's going to be more conflict with the US in our world. They don't really explain to you how this works. We see that this is actually a scenario that's only going to happen in their world where China continues to infringe on US interests. On the human rights argument, they tell you that there's going to be these abuses no matter what, there's no solvency. But at the point where we tell you that Chinese hegemony puts like a signaling argument that shows you that these abuses are okay, like we are still going to see an increase in their world. But even if you don't buy that, the main scenario you're going to be voting on here is the US-China tensions. Once again, overlapping spheres of influence in the Pacific between China and the US will have drastic impacts. Conflicts will lead to risk of war, and it's also going to be hurting these Pacific Island states the most when conflicts between the US and China increase military presence and lead to a lot of detriment in that region. Given that the military is the greatest polluter, this increase in presence is only going to destroy local ecosystems, which are key to Pacific Island fisheries and thus their economies. And for all those reasons, you're going to be voting AF.
Okay, is anyone not ready? No? Before I go into my speech, I'd just like to provide a brief order. My name is Rajiv Sharma. I'm going to be the second speaker for the negation. I'm going to be starting off with an overview on this round as a whole, then heading into the negation case about economic issues, moving on to the affirmation, and then putting an underview at the bottom. Is anyone not ready? No? The affirmation makes a fatal flaw in their second speech by fundamentally conceding that all of this US aid that has been going on for the past 20 years has done nothing to improve the material conditions of these Pacific Island states. As Davis tells you in the second speech, China has the unique capability to actually improve the material conditions of workers and people in developing countries. Seeing that the status quo simply does not have the ability under the United States to improve these conditions, you are going to be voting for the negation there alone. Let's go into the negation case. A lot of this analysis coming from the affirmation is how China A is going to be causing job loss. They give you the statistics of 200,000 jobs lost in all of Africa. B, causing infrastructure issues. They give you one impact about Angola and how there are roads to nowhere. And C, how this is going to be setting a really bad precedent. Let's take this down one by one. Firstly, let's look at the job loss analysis. As Davis tells you specifically, this is a really minor issue. Compared to the entire continent, 200,000 workers is a minuscule amount. Furthermore, if anything, we tell you that China actually creates a total number of jobs. Look at the warrant coming from the IMF that Davis tells you that in Luanda, unemployment decreased by 4.5 percentage points. That means that Angolans now have the capability to get an actual high-paying job within construction and improve their material conditions. We give you further analysis that states that this warmongering about China being a debt trap is uniquely bad. Let's go into this analysis about debt. Firstly, there are two specific warrants here. One is in Pakistan. The other is in Ethiopia. In both of these scenarios, China actually forgave the debt of developing nations. We specifically tell you that this can happen in Pacific Island states as well. This is also backed up by further peer-reviewed studies. Vijay Prashad, the professor emeritus at Trinity College within the Asia Department, writes that China historically has oftentimes been lenient in debt recusal processes. That means that inherently we give you analysis that China has the ability to forgive debt. That means that these countries are going to be getting infrastructure and seeing decreases in total unemployment. Let's go into this analysis about Kenya. Davis gives you the warranting that states that this is actually a net benefit because Kenya is using this cement for their own infrastructure processes. We state that, yeah, when more domestic production goes on, that's probably going to decrease a nation's total exportation, development, and competitiveness, but overall means that they are going to have greater material aid and capabilities. That's really good for today's round and these nations which materially do not have strength. Finally, let's go into this analysis about precedent. Aisha Ahmad, a researcher at Oxford University that specifically analyzes the usage of land within China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, writes that long-term, China has improved the material conditions of agrarian employees, moving them into into more efficient forms of manufacturing and better material conditions. We give you so much analysis that states that all of this analysis about China is simply hyped up, and instead, you should be preferring our peer-reviewed studies that contradict them. Don't go for their cherry-pick warrants, look at the truth. Secondly, let's look at this disadvantage about xenophobia. If anything, this is really important. When was the last time China actively invaded a country in the Middle East off of false pretenses? China overall has been a lens of global peace. There are a couple of warrants on this. The first is the Ethiopia-Eritrea border dispute. We can see that literally, according to Abiy Ahmed, the current president of Ethiopia, that China's mediation between the two nations, which have been going at it for hundreds of years, is uniquely good and has solved the crisis. He also writes that the freight railway between Asmara and Addis Ababa has improved the material conditions of the countries and benefited their infrastructure. That means long-term, these countries are seeing conflict resolution and better material conditions. The affirmation tries to hype them up as some major war hawk, but if anything, we see China as a greater lens for peace. Finally, let's go into this analysis about the South China Sea. Davis tells you that China establishing sovereignty over their own territory that is literally just a couple miles away from their border probably is not going to be a major challenge to the US, who is thousands of miles away. If anything, he gives you analysis that states that security within these regions have increased, and overall economic shipping has not had any issues. That means that you cannot believe the affirmations analysis that states specifically that this is going to have negative impacts. Let's go into their advantage about OBOR being bad. We give you analysis on the link and impact level that states long-term, China has the ability to improve material conditions of developing nations. You can cross-apply all of the evidence that we give you that states that long-term, they are going to have the ability to raise literacy rates, improve infrastructure, and improve unemployment. They specifically state that this is going to be a net negative, but by gut checking this and looking at the peer-reviewed analysis, we see that this is simply not true. Materially, China is better than the United States and has had long-term improvement. Finally, let's look at further analysis they give you about how China improves the surveillance state within these nations. Specifically, we see that China is in a unique actor here. Prashad Kandabi, the head of the Asia department at the University of Leicester, writes that the US also is oftentimes a major supporter of these quote-unquote corrupt regimes. That means that even if China leaves, the US is still going to be there. And if anything, China being there has unique material advantages. Let's go into their second advantage about Chinese hegemony. We tell you that they are overhyping this scenario. Let's look at the information from the Cato Institute that Davis gives you in his second speech, which states specifically that doing this is not going to cause a war. If anything, he tells you that this is going to be improving economic conditions there in order to further ensure that shipping will be safe. That means long-term that China will be able to stabilize this region without causing a war. The affirmation perpetuates the narrative that China is destructive, but we've seen that it's anything but that. Finally, let's look at this analysis of Uyghurs. They tell you that somehow by not giving aid to Pacific Island nations, that somehow Central Asia is going to get better. Davis tells you that this doesn't link. If anything, major pressure such as UN resolutions has not worked. That means that China pulling out or even gaining the support of these Central or Pacific Island nations is not going to have any beneficial impacts. Overall, China is a material benefiter and supporter of these nations and should be evaluated in this round. The United States has not worked and will never work. For a stronger Pacific Island area, we urge a strong negation ballot. Thank you.
To preface this speech, my order will primarily be made up of case at the top with like reasons why we win, and then going on to preemptive arguments. One sec. Okay, is anyone not ready? No? Okay, my time will begin now. The negation is winning this round for a couple of key reasons. Let's go to the first reason. Almost the entirety of the economic uniqueness on our economic disadvantage is dropped by the affirmation in the second speech, which effectively conceives the fact that China is really good for economic gain and that China is the only one that can give economic gain. The US has not been able to give the economic benefits that these countries in the Pacific Islands have been wanting. And the status quo in the past 20 years has proven that. So if we want to have any material gain in economic benefits, China is the only actor that can solve because they have a past precedent of doing so, and we give you a plethora of warrants of why they have been successful in other countries. So with that, you should be weighing the economic benefits alone. We've proven to you that unemployment decreases when China gets involved, even if some jobs are displaced. We've also proven that GDP per capita increases and per capita income increases. This was all not touched by the affirmation in the second speech. This effectively proves that China is a good actor and will do good things for Pacific Islands in terms of increasing their quality of life and decreasing the dehumanization. Specifically look to obesity rates as another example of this. This also went conceded. Now, let's go into a couple of arguments that the negation might make on this specific point. They might tell you that on net, like China still has bad things by debt, but we already gave you multiple warrants about debt. They tried to perpetuate this narrative that China creates debt traps. Again, there's no reasoning behind that. We give you analysis for actually why China resolves debt crises and actually paid off debt in 2 different countries. That's not a cherry-picked warrant, that's specific examples and facts. We give you warranted analysis about why China has actually been good, and then in the affirmation by continuing to say that China is actually bad is just like perpetuating what the US has continued to believe without looking at facts. The second reason why we win is specifically the fact that the affirmation largely has no solvency. On the first point about OBOR good, you can use a lot of the OBOR bad, you can use a lot of the analysis we give on the economic point about how OBOR has actually been key. Even if roads to nowhere are built on net, quality of life improved in the African countries and would only improve in the Pacific Island nations. Look to those GDP examples again. So for that alone, you probably shouldn't buy the fact that OBOR is bad, considering the debt traps have been paid off. And on the point about hegemony, you probably shouldn't buy this either because we gave you multiple warrants about why this would still exist in the status quo and it wouldn't be enough to change it. It wouldn't increase it, and things have not worked to check back in the past. Giving China potentially a small amount of more hegemony isn't going to do anything on the national scale to the effect that they say. They might tell you that it's going to create some sort of large global conflict between the United States, but again, extend my partner's analysis about why this won't happen, and it's a really small chance that it does, and also extend the turn about this xenophobic narrative, specifically about how the US military, the only thing to think about China is as China continues to do things, we have to build up more threats against them. The biggest threat is China. If we continue to believe that China is a threat and reject their developmental assistance, this only means that US soldiers are going to continue to believe that we ought to have more power against China. This also went unrefuted. This proves that there's still a risk of a conflict occurring in the affirmation world, which probably means that this point should be dropped altogether because there's not specific warranted analysis about a percent chance of increasing. If we're going to weigh the warrants, first look at probability. There's a really low probability of this occurring, and the hegemony increasing to the level that they say is also a really low probability. Also look at the probability on our side. It's a 100% probability that the Pacific Islands will receive economic benefit, which is also really high on magnitude. Don't let them respond to any of that in their last speech because we've effectively proven that this magnitude and probability is incredibly high and these nations will receive benefits. The probability that these factor will inevitably be continued into the status quo as the affirmation continues to reject China. People say the US tells everyone to reject them, but if we look at the facts and we look at the analysis, they have paid off debt, they've improved quality of life, displaced. On net, the benefits were good and greater than the bad. If we're weighing by net benefits, then obviously the net benefits flow to the neg side, which means that as the judge, you should be voting for the negation to ensure that these countries have better economic benefits while mitigating losses. Thank you.
Order is going to be an overview of the debate, then the second advantage, and then the econ advantage or econ debate together. All right. In all honesty, the economics debate is pretty much a wash. Both sides are giving you two different sets of evidence on both the benefits and the detriments of Chinese aid, but neither side is significantly ahead on determining whether China is better for the economy. Therefore, the cleanest impact you can vote on today is the US-Chinese conflict scenario, which goes woefully undercovered by the negation. We have access to impacts of risk of war, as well as the high probability impact of military pollution causing the environmental detriments that hurt the local fishing industry that turn the economic argument. So let's go on to the military argument. Once again, you're going to be voting on this because it's simply the cleanest place for you to vote on in today's debate. They don't respond enough to the arguments here. Specifically, I want to highlight the warrant that goes conceded that Pacific Island nations have a special relationship with the US in which the US is responsible for the security and defense matters relating to the country. This means that if China starts to come in with their developmental assistance, the US has treaty obligations, relationship obligations to start to increase, start to come to security and defense matters, and given that the US sees China as a military risk, they will likely do so. There's no response to this, which means that on the link differential, we're out ahead on the probability here. Moreover, our evidence shows that the US military has a vested interest in the region and will be significantly threatened by Chinese presence, which will lead to tensions. There's two implications here. The first is the risk of war impact, which is going to outweigh on magnitude. If both the US and the Chinese military are in close proximity with each other in the same region, then that increases the risk of tensions and miscalculation in war. That's a high magnitude impact that flows our direction. But even if you buy their analysis that impact is low probability, we still have another high probability, high magnitude impact with military presence. My partner tells you, and this goes conceded, that the military is the greatest polluter, which means that once China and the US have increasing their military presence in the region, this would cause a lot of environmental pollution. And given that the fishing industry is one of the biggest industries for Pacific Island nations, pollution will damage their fishing industry, which ultimately short circuits the whole fishing industry idea, which means that we actually control the internal link to the economics debate here, given that pollution is going to pretty much devastate the livelihoods of many Pacific Islanders. So we're winning on probability on this argument as well as magnitude and time frame, I guess, because we short circuit it. But let's go to the economics debate. Once again, the economics debate pretty much becomes a wash. At best, we're winning on it. At worst, it's a wash. So let's go over like each of the specific areas. First is that of debt diplomacy. We have evidence that China has already seized ports from Sri Lanka and Pakistan. While they may have evidence that China has forgiven debt, like neither side is really coming out ahead on this. And moreover, our specific evidence is contextualized to specific island nations at the point where Samoa and Tonga are struggling with immense debt to China. And that pretty much goes conceded, which means that debt is a major concern with the economy. But once again, it's pretty much a wash there. But let's go into the jobs argument. Jobs is a wash as well. We tell you that China brings in their own workers and displaces local workers working on infrastructure projects. Like even if you buy their Angola evidence, neither side is really ahead on this debate. There's no conclusive determination whether China will actually increase jobs or not, given that like the evidence is going in all different directions. On the local industry argument, we tell you that Kenya, like China's past precedent with Kenya has led to the cement industry being outcompeted. And we tell you that that would likely happen with the fishing industry as well, when China starts to bring in all their own fishes and outcompete local fisheries. Even if you buy their analysis that China is going to lead to long-term economic development, we're winning on the short-term economic harm in this case, given that there's going to be a drop in jobs, given that China's precedent is to bring in their own workers here. All right, so pretty much the economics debate is a wash. Neither side is cleanly ahead. The clearest place to vote is military, but let's look at their xenophobia argument. This is the last out they have in this round, but they're not going to have access to the impacts here, given that it's all non-unique. My partner tells you that the Pentagon has already labeled Russia and China as the greatest military threats. So even if this plan passes, you're still going to see evidence of a posturing of China as not a favorable actor. So the plan is not going to suddenly change the perception of China in a more favorable light, and it's not going to significantly worsen at it, given that the Pentagon has already labeled China as a great military threat. Moreover, do not buy their own analysis that China is as perfect as they present it to be, because China has a lot of human rights abuses themselves. You can extend our analysis about their oppression of Uyghur Muslims in their own state, which is a clear reason why China is also is not as good as they think it is. Moreover, this whole xenophobia argument isn't a reason to reject Chinese developmental assistance. We should be looking at the impacts of accepting China developmental assistance as it relates to the economy and conflicts, and we're going to be ahead on that debate. Awesome. Great debate, guys.
Good debate.